Thank you for being a valued supporter of the 10X podcast group. Your dedication means the world to us. Today, we bring you a gripping tale titled, The Ultimate Deception. Your continued support and subscription fuel our passion for storytelling, and we deeply appreciate every moment you spend with us. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's compelling narrative. Chapter 1. The Seed of Deception. The newsroom buzzed with a familiar hum of clacking keyboards and ringing phones, but Elena Moore's desk sat in a cocoon of silence. Her eyes were fixed on the screen before her, a single document glowing with potential and danger. Every sentence, every word carried weight. This was no ordinary exposé. This was the story that could either cement her legacy or destroy her life. Elena's cursor hovered over the paragraph she'd rewritten for the 5th time. Her hands trembling slightly. She leaned back in her chair, the soft creak breaking the quiet around her. The damning document sat on the other side of her desk, a ledger allegedly showing Senator Victor Kane funneling bribes through offshore accounts. It was incomplete, with key transactions redacted or missing altogether. The evidence was real enough to hint at corruption but not solid enough to prove it. Her deadline loomed. The truth wasn't enough. Elena closed her eyes, recalling her first encounter with Victor Kane. He had been giving a speech at a local charity gala, his charm lighting up the room like the chandeliers above him. His words were full of promises: support for local schools, housing for low-income families, justice for the marginalized. The crowd had hung on his every word, swept away by his charisma. But Elena had seen through it all. She'd recognized the sly glint in his eyes, the subtle arrogance behind his practiced humility. A few weeks later, whispers began trickling in from her sources. Contracts awarded to Kane's cronies, campaign funds funneled into his personal accounts, and a construction project mysteriously abandoned after millions of dollars had vanished. Elena knew she was onto something big. What she hadn't anticipated was how carefully Kane had covered his tracks. A sharp knock at her cubicle snapped her out of her thoughts. Ryan Clark leaned against the partition, holding 2 cups of coffee. His disheveled blonde hair and rolled-up sleeves gave him an air of casual confidence that often put people at ease. "Elena, you've been locked in here all day," he said, placing a cup on her desk. "What's the verdict? Is Kane going down?" She managed a weak smile. Still piecing it together. Ryan glanced at the pile of documents and scribbled notes scattered across her desk. "You're obsessed, you know that. Maybe take a break, get some air. Kane's been untouchable for years. Don't kill yourself trying to change that." Elena stiffened. Maybe that's the problem. Everyone's too afraid to try. Ryan raised his hands in mock surrender. "Fair point. Just don't lose yourself in this. You've got nothing to prove." Elena watched him walk away, a twinge of guilt curling in her stomach. Ryan didn't know how far she was willing to go, what she'd already done. That night, in the dim light of her apartment, Elena stared at the ledger spread out on her kitchen table. It wasn't enough. The thought gnawed at her like a persistent itch. She knew Kane's empire was built on lies and exploitation. But without concrete proof, her article would be dismissed as speculation. Her laptop hummed softly as she opened an editing program, her fingers hesitating over the keys. She wasn't creating lies, she told herself. She was filling in gaps, reconstructing a truth that had been deliberately hidden. If Kane was innocent, why would he redact these sections? Why would he bury these numbers? The questions justified her actions. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She crafted the missing transactions with precision, matching the style and format of the genuine entries. By the time she finished, the ledger looked seamless. The fabricated evidence didn't stand out. It blended perfectly with the real. Elena leaned back, staring at the completed document. Her heart raced. This was the proof she needed to bring Kane down. But at what cost? The article went live the following morning. The headline screamed across screens nationwide. The Untouchable Senator. A deep dive into Victor Kane's web of corruption. Within minutes, the newsroom exploded. Phones rang off the hook, reporters scrambled for follow-ups, and the editor-in-chief beamed with pride as he congratulated Elena in front of the entire staff. Her inbox flooded with messages, praise from colleagues, outrage from Kane's supporters, and calls for action from advocacy groups. Elena felt a flicker of satisfaction as she watched the chaos unfold. For years, Kane had hidden behind his polished image, exploiting his power with impunity. Now the tide had turned. But the euphoria was short-lived. By midday, Kane's press secretary issued a scathing statement, vehemently denying the allegations. "This so-called evidence is nothing more than a baseless attack," the statement read. "Senator Kane has dedicated his life to serving the public with integrity. We will not tolerate these unfounded accusations and will pursue every legal avenue to clear his name." Elena's phone buzzed incessantly. The newsroom smelled blood, and every reporter wanted a piece of the unfolding battle. She ignored the calls and emails, retreating to the quiet of her office. The weight of what she'd done began to press down on her. She had won the first round, but Kane wouldn't back down. He was too powerful, too dangerous. As the sun set, Elena glanced at her phone and saw a single message waiting for her. It was from an unknown number. "You've made a grave mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with." Her blood ran cold. The game had begun. Chapter 2. The trap is set. The message haunted Elena. The words replayed in her mind like a broken record as she sat in her office, staring at the glow of her computer screen. She had expected retaliation, but the message felt personal, like the sender knew more than just her name. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Grace. Elena hesitated before answering. "Hey," she said, forcing a casual tone. "Hey yourself," Grace replied, her voice light but concerned. "You okay? I saw the article. You've really stirred up a hornet's nest." Elena leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. "Yeah, it's been intense. But I'm fine." "You don't sound fine. You sound like you haven't slept in a week." Elena smiled despite herself. Grace had always been able to read her, even from miles away. "I'll sleep when this is over. Just be careful, okay? Guys like Kane don't go down without a fight." The words struck a nerve. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. "I know what I'm doing, Grace. Don't worry about me." "I always worry about you," Grace said softly. "You're all I've got." The line went quiet after they hung up, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts. Grace didn't know the half of it. If Kane ever found out about the fabricated evidence, the fallout would be catastrophic, not just for Elena but for anyone close to her. By the next morning, Kane's team had gone on the offensive. The senator appeared on every major news network, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the firestorm of accusations swirling around him. "This is a politically motivated attack," he said in one interview, his voice steady and confident. "I have dedicated my career to public service, and I will not allow baseless lies to tarnish my reputation." The public reaction was divided. Supporters rallied behind Kane, while others demanded his resignation. Protesters gathered outside his office, holding signs that read, "No more lies," and "Kane must go." Elena watched the coverage unfold, her stomach twisting. The fabricated evidence had done its job. It had turned the tide against Kane. But the senator's calm facade unsettled her. He wasn't just fighting back, he was strategizing. Later that day, Ryan Clark approached her desk, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You're the talk of the town," he said, dropping a printout of her article onto her desk. "The whole newsroom's buzzing. But Kane's not going down without a fight." Elena glanced at the printout, her own words staring back at her like a challenge. "He's just buying time," she said. "Eventually, the truth will catch up to him." Ryan hesitated, studying her. "You really think he's guilty?" She met his gaze, forcing confidence into her voice. "I know he is." He nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Well, if you need backup, you know where to find me." Elena watched him walk away, unease settling in her chest. Ryan was sharp, and if he started digging too deeply, he might uncover the cracks in her story. She couldn't afford any loose ends, not now. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Kane's legal team filed a defamation lawsuit against the newspaper, demanding the article be retracted. The editor-in-chief called an emergency meeting, the tension in the room palpable. "This is a battle we're prepared to fight," the editor said, his voice firm. "But we need to make sure our evidence holds up. Elena, I want you to work with legal to go over everything. Leave no stone unturned." Elena nodded, her heart pounding. She couldn't let anyone else examine the fabricated documents too closely. After the meeting, she returned to her desk, her mind racing. She needed a plan, a way to reinforce her story before Kane's team dismantled it. But before she could focus, her phone buzzed with another message from the unknown number. "We know the truth. Stop now, or you'll regret it." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She stared at the screen, her thoughts spiraling. Was it Kane? One of his allies? Or someone closer to her? That night, as Elena walked to her car in the dimly lit parking garage, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She glanced over her shoulder, her pulse quickening. A man in a dark suit stood at the far end of the garage, his face obscured by shadows. "Elena Moore," he called out, his voice calm but chilling. "We need to talk." She didn't wait to hear more. Gripping her keys like a weapon, she darted toward her car, her heart hammering in her chest. The man's footsteps quickened, closing the distance between them. "Elena, stop," he shouted. She reached her car and fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking. As she climbed inside and slammed the door, the man reached the window, his face illuminated by the interior light. He was clean-cut, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. "You can't run from this," he said, his voice muffled by the glass. "Kane doesn't lose." Elena started the engine and sped away, her mind racing. The message was clear. She was in over her head. But she couldn't back down, not now. As she drove through the dark streets, one thought consumed her. Kane wasn't just defending himself. He was playing offense. And the stakes were higher than she'd ever imagined. Chapter 3. Cracks in the Armor. The parking garage encounter replayed in Elena's mind like a bad dream. The man's cold stare, his measured tone, and the way he said Kane's name. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. Kane was no longer playing defense. He was hunting her. The next morning, Elena sat in her apartment, her laptop open but untouched. Her inbox overflowed with emails, but one stood out. The subject line read, "Your lies will be exposed." She hesitated before clicking. The email contained a single link, along with the words, "You can't outrun the truth." Elena's heart pounded as she hovered over the link. She closed the laptop and leaned back, her mind racing. The walls were closing in, and the cracks in her fabricated story were beginning to show. At the newsroom, her colleagues were abuzz with the latest developments. Kane's legal team had announced a press conference, claiming they had evidence that would dismantle Elena's exposé. "Elena," her editor barked, summoning her into his office. The room smelled of stale coffee and stress. The editor, a barrel-chested man with graying hair, leaned against his desk, his face a mask of concern. "We've got a problem," he said, tossing a folder onto the desk. "Kane's team claims they've uncovered forged documents in your report." Elena's stomach dropped. She forced herself to stay calm, picking up the folder with trembling hands. Inside were copies of the very documents she had fabricated, but now they were marked with discrepancies Kane's team had flagged. Fonts that didn't match, metadata suggesting the files had been altered. "This isn't looking good," the editor said. "You're sure about your sources?" Elena nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I stand by my story." "Good. Then get ahead of this. We need you to write a follow-up, double down on your claims, and discredit Kane's rebuttal before his press conference." Elena nodded again, but as she left the office, her confidence wavered. She had always believed in the power of journalism to uncover the truth, but now she was trapped in her own web of lies. Back at her desk, Ryan Clark appeared, leaning against the edge of her cubicle. "You okay?" he asked, his blue eyes scanning her face. "Yeah," she lied. "Just a lot to handle." Ryan hesitated. "Look, I've been following this Kane story and something doesn't add up." Elena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his tone casual but probing. "I checked some of the documents you cited in the article. The metadata is off. It's like they were edited recently." Her pulse quickened. She forced a laugh, hoping it sounded natural. "You're overthinking it, Ryan. Kane's team is just trying to muddy the waters." "Maybe," he said, though his expression remained skeptical. "But if there's anything you need to tell me, anything you might have overlooked." "I didn't," she snapped, more forcefully than she intended. "The evidence is solid. End of story." Ryan studied her for a moment before nodding. "'Kay. Just let me know if you need help." As he walked away, Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Ryan was getting too close, and she couldn't afford any more scrutiny. That evening, Kane's press conference aired live. The senator stood at a podium, flanked by his legal team. His expression was one of calm indignation as he addressed the cameras. "Ms. Moore's article is not only defamatory but rooted in falsehoods," Kane said, his voice steady. "We have concrete evidence proving that key documents in her report were fabricated. This is not just an attack on me but an attack on truth itself." Elena watched from her apartment, gripping the edge of her couch. Kane was laying the groundwork to destroy her. She needed to act, and fast. Her phone buzzed. It was another text from the unknown number. "This is your final warning. Retract the story, or your family pays the price." Elena's blood ran cold. Her mind immediately went to Grace. Without thinking, she called her sister. "Grace, are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm fine," Grace replied, confused. "What's going on?" "Just be careful, okay? Lock your doors. Don't go out alone." "Elena, you're scaring me." "What's happening?" "It's nothing," Elena lied. "Just do it. Please." As she hung up, a new wave of resolve washed over her. She couldn't let Kane intimidate her. But she also couldn't ignore the growing danger to those she cared about. The next day, Elena met with Detective Samuel Ortega, a man she hoped could provide her with answers or protection. Ortega was a seasoned investigator, with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. "So, you think Kane's behind the threats?" Ortega asked, leaning back in his chair. "Yes," Elena said. "He's trying to scare me into backing down." Ortega studied her for a moment. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Moore. Kane doesn't just fight back. He annihilates." "I'm not afraid of him," Elena lied. "You should be," Ortega said bluntly. "But I'll look into it. Just know that if you're keeping anything from me, it'll only make things worse." As Elena left his office, she felt the weight of his words. The cracks in her story were growing wider, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. That night, she opened her laptop and stared at the forged documents. She could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. But she couldn't stop now. Kane was a monster, and if she went down, she'd make sure he went down with her. Her hands trembled as she began typing, crafting a follow-up article to discredit Kane's claims. The lies poured out effortlessly, each one a brick in the fragile fortress she was building around herself. But deep down, Elena knew the truth. Her fortress wasn't made of stone, it was made of glass. And Kane was about to throw a rock. Chapter 4. A Web of Lies. The newsroom was a furnace of tension the next morning. Phones rang incessantly, reporters barked updates to one another, and screens flashed with the latest developments. Elena sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard as she polished her follow-up article, a calculated rebuttal aimed at dismantling Kane's claims of forgery. Her editor-in-chief stood nearby, arms folded, his face a mix of anticipation and unease. "This needs to hit hard, Elena," he said. "If we're going to stand by your story, we need to go all in." She nodded, though the weight of his words pressed heavily on her chest. "I've got this," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. The rebuttal went live at noon. The headline blared. Senator Kane's desperation. A smear campaign against the truth. Elena's article meticulously dissected Kane's press conference, painting his claims of forgery as a calculated distraction from his corruption. She included snippets of the fabricated ledger, presenting them as irrefutable evidence of Kane's guilt. The response was immediate. Social media exploded with hashtags like #KaneLies and #JusticeForThePeople. For a moment, Elena felt a flicker of triumph. But it was short-lived. That evening, as she left the office, her phone buzzed with a text. Another unknown number. "You've crossed the line. The consequences are coming." Elena glanced around the parking lot, her heart racing. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. She quickened her pace to her car, gripping her keys like a weapon. As she slid into the driver's seat, she noticed a folded piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. She hesitated, her pulse pounding. Finally, she stepped out and retrieved the note. The message was written in neat, precise handwriting. "We know what you did. You can't hide forever." A chill ran down her spine. She crumpled the note and drove off, her mind racing. The walls were closing in faster than she anticipated. The next morning, Grace called. Elena's chest tightened as she answered. "Grace, what's wrong?" "Someone's been following me," Grace said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was imagining it, but last night I saw a man outside my apartment. He was just standing there watching." Elena's grip on the phone tightened. "Did you call the police?" "They said there's nothing they can do unless he actually does something," Grace said, her voice rising in frustration. "Elena, what's going on? Are you in trouble?" Elena hesitated. She couldn't tell Grace the full truth. Not yet. "I don't know," she lied. "But I'll handle it. Just stay inside, and don't answer the door for anyone." After hanging up, Elena sat in her kitchen, staring at the wall. Kane was sending a message, and she had no doubt he would escalate. She couldn't let Grace become collateral damage. That day, Elena reached out to Detective Ortega. They met at a diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes. Ortega sipped his coffee, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "So, you think Kane's people are following your sister now?" he asked. "Yes," Elena said, her voice firm. "I need you to protect her." Ortega nodded slowly. "I can assign a unit to keep an eye on her place. But let me be clear, Elena. If there's more to this story than you're telling me, you're only digging a deeper hole for yourself." Elena avoided his gaze, focusing on the swirling coffee in her cup. "Just protect her, okay? I'll handle the rest." Ortega leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You're playing a dangerous game, Ms. Moore. And people who play games with Kane usually lose." Back at the newsroom, Ryan Clark cornered Elena at her desk. His usually easygoing demeanor had been replaced by a hard, skeptical edge. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "In private." Elena hesitated, then followed him to an empty conference room. Ryan closed the door and turned to face her. "What's really going on, Elena? And don't give me the party line about exposing corruption. I've seen the documents, and something doesn't add up." She crossed her arms, her defenses rising. "What are you accusing me of, Ryan?" "I'm not accusing you," he said, his voice softening. "I'm trying to help. But if you've bent the truth even a little, you need to come clean now. Before it's too late." Elena's stomach twisted. Ryan was too perceptive, too determined. She couldn't risk him uncovering the full extent of her lies. "The evidence is solid," she said, her voice cold. "If you can't trust me, then stay out of my way." Ryan looked at her for a long moment, disappointment flickering in his eyes. "You're not the person I thought you were," he said quietly before walking out. Elena stood alone in the empty room, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. She had alienated one of her closest allies, but she couldn't stop now. The truth, or her version of it, had to come out. That night, a package arrived at her apartment. It was a plain, unmarked envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a note. "Watch this. Then decide if the truth is worth it." Elena plugged the drive into her laptop, her hands shaking. The video that played was grainy but unmistakable. It showed a man, Victor Kane, shaking hands with a group of men in suits. The audio was muffled, but key phrases stood out. Offshore accounts. Campaign funds. Cleanup crew. Her breath caught. This was the smoking gun she needed, the real evidence to bring Kane down. But as the video ended, a chilling realization hit her. Whoever had sent this knew about her lies. And they were playing their own game. Chapter 5. A dangerous alliance. Elena replayed the video, her eyes glued to the screen. The grainy footage of Victor Kane was damning, a clandestine meeting with clear implications of corruption. This was the kind of evidence she'd been desperate for, the kind she hadn't needed to fabricate. But the question loomed: who had sent it and why now? The note's warning echoed in her mind. Then decide if the truth is worth it. The next morning, Detective Samuel Ortega called. "We need to talk. Meet me at the cafe on 5th noon." Elena didn't argue. When she arrived, Ortega was already seated in a corner booth, nursing a cup of coffee. His sharp eyes narrowed as she slid into the seat across from him. "I did some digging," Ortega began, his voice low. "The threats against your sister, they're real. My guys spotted one of Kane's men outside her building last night." Elena's stomach clenched. "Then arrest him." Ortega shook his head. "It's not that simple. He didn't do anything illegal, just stood there watching. But it's enough to send a message." Elena leaned in, her voice trembling with anger. "He's using my sister to get to me." "Exactly," Ortega said. "Which is why I'm asking you. What aren't you telling me?" She hesitated, debating how much to reveal. Finally, she reached into her bag and slid the USB drive across the table. "This showed up at my apartment last night. It's a recording of Kane in what looks like a deal to funnel campaign funds offshore." Ortega picked up the drive, his expression unreadable. "Where did it come from?" "I don't know. It was anonymous." Ortega studied her, his gaze piercing. "This could be the break we need. But if there's something else, something you're hiding, it's going to blow up in your face. Trust me, Elena, you don't want to be on the wrong side of this." Elena nodded, but her silence spoke volumes. Ortega pocketed the drive and stood. "I'll get this analyzed. In the meantime, keep your head down. Kane's people are watching you." Elena returned to her apartment, her mind racing. The video was a lifeline, but it was also a trap. Whoever sent it knew about her fabricated evidence. If they exposed her, everything, her career, her credibility, her safety, would crumble. Her phone buzzed. Another unknown number. "The video is a gift. Use it wisely. But remember, lies have consequences." She stared at the message, a cold sweat forming on her brow. The sender wasn't just helping her, they were controlling her. The next day, Ortega called again. "The video checks out," he said. "It's legitimate. We're building a case, but we'll need you to testify." Elena's breath caught. "Testify? You're the journalist who broke the story," Ortega said. "Your testimony will lend weight to the evidence. This could take Kane down for good." The irony stung. She was being asked to testify about the truth in a case built partially on lies. If she went forward, her fabricated evidence could be uncovered. But if she backed out, Kane would win. That night, Ryan Clark showed up at her apartment. Elena opened the door reluctantly, her heart sinking at the determined look on his face. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside uninvited. "I've been digging into the story and I found something. The ledger you cited, it doesn't hold up." Elena froze. "What are you talking about?" Ryan pulled out a folder, flipping it open to reveal printouts of metadata and forensic analyses. The document's been tampered with. The timestamps don't match, and the formatting is inconsistent. Elena, did you fake this? Her mouth went dry. Ryan, you don't understand. Then explain it to me, he demanded, his voice rising. Because right now, it looks like you lied to bring Kane down. I had to, she said, her voice cracking. The truth wasn't enough. People like Kane, they bury the real evidence. I did what I had to do to expose him. Ryan stared at her, betrayal etched into his features. You crossed a line, Elena. And now you've put everyone in danger. Your sister, this paper, everyone who trusted you. I didn't have a choice, she shot back. Kane is a monster, and no one else was willing to take him on. Ryan shook his head. You always have a choice. But now, you've made us all complicit in your lies. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Elena sank to the floor, her head in her hands. The walls were closing in faster than ever. The next morning, Elena received another package. This one contained a single photo. Grace walking to her car, unaware of the man watching her from the shadows. Attached was a note. We warned you. Pull the story or she pays the price. Elena's blood boiled. She had underestimated Kane's ruthlessness, and now her sister's life was on the line. But pulling the story wasn't an option. Not when the real evidence was finally within her grasp. She grabbed her phone and called Ortega. We need to move on Kane. Now. Ortega's voice was calm but firm. We're building the case, but it's not ready yet. You need to sit tight. I can't sit tight, Elena snapped. They're threatening my sister. Which is exactly why you need to be careful, Ortega said. Let me handle this. Elena hung up, frustration coursing through her. She couldn't wait for the system to work. It was too slow, too cautious. If she wanted to protect Grace and bring Kane down, she would have to take matters into her own hands. Late that night, Elena sat at her desk, staring at the photo of Grace. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one riskier than the last. She had come this far, crossing lines she never thought she would. Now there was no turning back. With trembling hands, she opened her laptop and began writing her final piece, a story that would expose everything. Kane's corruption, the threats, and the lies that had brought them to this point. It was her only chance to turn the tide before it was too late. But as she typed, a single thought lingered in the back of her mind. Who was really pulling the strings? Chapter 6. The breaking point. Elena's fingers trembled as she typed, every keystroke a battle against the voice in her head telling her to stop. She was crafting a story that would expose everything. Kane's corruption, the threats against her sister, and the anonymous video that had changed the game. But woven into her narrative was a subtle defense, an attempt to shift focus away from the fabricated evidence she knew wouldn't withstand scrutiny. When she finished, she read the piece aloud to herself. It was bold, raw, and damning. It left no room for Kane to spin his way out. And yet, it was also a dangerous gamble. If anyone connected the dots between the real and the fake, her entire career and life would be over. Elena leaned back in her chair, exhaustion weighing her down. The clock on her laptop read 2:47 a.m. She closed her eyes, but the image of Grace being watched by Kane's men refused to fade. She had to protect her sister. She had to see this through. By morning, her article had gone live. The newsroom erupted as soon as the piece hit the web. Phones rang off the hook, and reporters crowded her desk, eager for details. Her editor-in-chief appeared. His face flushed with excitement. This is brilliant, Elena. You've cornered him. There's no way Kane walks away from this. But Elena barely registered his praise. Her eyes were glued to the screen, where a live feed from a news network showed Kane stepping up to a podium. Victor Kane's composure was impeccable, his polished suit and steady gaze exuding confidence. But his tone was sharp, calculated. These accusations are not only false but dangerous, Kane began, his voice measured. Ms. Moore has shown a reckless disregard for the truth, endangering not just me but my family and staff. Today, I will prove that her so-called evidence is nothing more than a fabrication. Elena's breath caught as Kane gestured to a man standing off to the side. The man stepped forward, holding a USB drive, the same one she had handed to Ortega. This drive contains a video Ms. Moore has been using to support her baseless claims, Kane said. But what she failed to disclose is its source. Kane nodded, and the man played a clip on a screen behind him. The footage showed a grainy figure slipping the drive into a mailbox outside Elena's apartment. The timestamp was clear. Elena's stomach dropped. Whoever had sent the video hadn't just manipulated her. They had set her up. As the press conference continued, Kane unveiled his final blow. Our team has uncovered evidence that Ms. Moore's original documents, the ones she claims prove my corruption, were fabricated. This is no longer just a case of defamation. It is a criminal matter, and we will be pursuing charges. The newsroom fell silent. Elena's colleagues turned to her, their faces a mix of shock and confusion. Her editor broke the silence. Is this true, Elena? Did you fabricate evidence? Elena opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it now. Hours later, Elena sat in her apartment, the blinds drawn, her phone ringing incessantly. Calls from reporters, colleagues, and even Grace went unanswered. She couldn't face any of them, not yet. Her laptop pinged with an incoming email. The subject line read, "The game isn't over." With trembling hands, she opened the message. "You've been played, Elena. But you're not the only one. Kane isn't clean, and neither are the people who sent you that video. If you want the truth, meet me at the docks tonight. Midnight. Come alone." Elena stared at the screen, her heart racing. Could be a trap. But it could also be her last chance to salvage something from the wreckage of her life. At midnight, Elena arrived at the docks. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel fuel, and the distant hum of machinery provided a low, ominous soundtrack. She clutched her phone tightly, her eyes scanning the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness, a man in his late 40s, wearing a worn jacket and a guarded expression. He motioned for her to follow him to a secluded spot near a stack of shipping containers. "You're the journalist," he said, his voice low. "You've been digging into Kane." Elena nodded. "Who are you? Why did you send me that video?" The man lit a cigarette, his hand shaking slightly. "I used to work for Kane. I saw things that would destroy him if they ever got out. But you're not the only one after him. There are bigger players in this game." "Bigger players?" Elena asked, her pulse quickening. "Who?" The man exhaled a plume of smoke. "People who stand to lose billions if Kane goes down. They're the ones who gave you that video. They wanted you to take the fall, to draw attention away from their own crimes." Elena's mind raced. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've had enough," the man said. "I've got evidence, real evidence, that connects Kane to them. If you want to take him down, you'll need to use it carefully. Otherwise, you'll end up like the others." "The others?" Elena repeated. "Dead," the man said bluntly. He handed her a flash drive. "This is everything I've got. But once you use it, you'll have a target on your back." Elena stared at the drive, the weight of its implications pressing down on her. She was already in too deep. But now she had a choice. Walk away and let Kane win, or risk everything for the truth. By the time she returned to her apartment, dawn was breaking. She plugged the drive into her laptop, her hands shaking. The files it contained were explosive: bank statements, wire transfers, and emails that tied Kane to a global network of corruption. But as she sifted through the evidence, another realization hit her. The people behind the video weren't just protecting Kane. They were protecting themselves. And they wouldn't let her expose them without a fight. Elena leaned back in her chair, exhaustion and determination warring within her. The breaking point had come. And she was about to decide which lines she was willing to cross, and who she was willing to take down with her. Chapter 7. The Final Game. Elena sat in the dim light of her apartment, the glow of her laptop illuminating the files before her. The evidence on the flash drive was more damning than anything she could have imagined. It painted a picture of systemic corruption. Victor Kane wasn't just guilty of embezzlement and bribery. He was a cog in a global machine of greed and exploitation. The names in the files included corporate executives, lobbyists, and even foreign dignitaries. This wasn't just about Kane. This was about a network that controlled billions. Her phone buzzed. It was Grace. Elena hesitated before answering. "Elena," Grace said, her voice trembling. "There's someone outside again. I think they're watching me." Elena closed her eyes, guilt and rage surging within her. "Lock the doors, Grace. Don't let anyone in. I'll handle this." "Handle it how?" Grace demanded. "What's going on, Elena? I deserve to know." "You don't want to know," Elena said softly. "Trust me." After hanging up, Elena knew she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to act, but the path forward was fraught with danger. The files she held were both a weapon and a death sentence. If she went public, she would be putting herself and Grace in the crosshairs of powerful people who wouldn't hesitate to silence her. Later that day, Elena met with Detective Ortega at a secluded cafe. She slid the flash drive across the table. "This is bigger than Kane," she said, her voice low. "There's a whole network behind him. If we're going to take him down, we have to expose all of it." Ortega picked up the drive, his expression darkening as he studied her. "You realize what you're doing, don't you? These people don't just fight back, they erase threats. You'll be risking everything." "I don't have a choice," Elena said. "They're already threatening my sister. If I back down now, they'll win." Ortega sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'll have my team analyze this. But if what you're saying is true, we'll need more than just a journalist's word. We'll need you to testify, to be the face of this case." The thought of standing in court, laying bare her story and her lies, made Elena's stomach churn. But she nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." That evening, as Elena left the cafe, her phone buzzed with a new text from an unknown number. "You were warned. Now it's too late." Elena's heart pounded as she glanced around the parking lot. A black SUV idled at the far end, its headlights cutting through the gloom. She quickened her pace, gripping her keys like a weapon. When she reached her car, she glanced back. The SUV's door opened, and a man stepped out, his face obscured by shadows. Without waiting, Elena climbed into her car and sped away, her hands shaking on the wheel. She couldn't go home, not with Grace in danger. Instead, she drove to a motel on the outskirts of town, checking in under a fake name. As she sat in the room, her mind raced with possibilities. The following day, Ortega called. "The files are legit," he said. "This is enough to launch an investigation into Kane and his network. But you need to know this isn't going to be clean. They're already mobilizing. We've received reports of people following your sister, and I've had to assign officers to keep an eye on her." Elena's throat tightened. "What do I do?" "You go public," Ortega said. "The best way to protect yourself is to make this too big for them to bury. Once the world is watching, they'll think twice about silencing you." Elena hung up, the weight of his words pressing down on her. Going public meant exposing herself to the full force of Kane's retaliation. It also meant admitting to her fabrications and risking her career, her freedom, and possibly her life. The next morning, Elena scheduled a live-streamed press conference. The newsroom was buzzing as she prepared her statement. Ryan Clark approached her, his expression unreadable. "You're really doing this?" he asked. "I don't have a choice," Elena replied. "This is bigger than me." Ryan hesitated, then nodded. "Good luck." As the cameras rolled, Elena stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and began. "My name is Elena Moore. I am a journalist, and I have uncovered evidence of systemic corruption involving Senator Victor Kane and a global network of powerful individuals. What I am about to share with you will change everything." She laid out the evidence, careful to focus on the files from the flash drive. But as she spoke, she felt the weight of her own lies pressing down on her. She knew it was only a matter of time before they came to light. As she concluded her statement, the room erupted in questions from reporters. But before she could answer, a loud crash echoed through the building. The room fell silent as armed men burst in, their faces obscured by masks. "Everyone down!" one of them shouted, brandishing a weapon. Elena's breath caught as chaos erupted around her. She dropped to the floor, her mind racing. This wasn't just a warning, this was a message. When the dust settled, the men were gone, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. No one was seriously injured, but the message was clear. The people Elena was fighting weren't afraid to use violence to silence her. Ortega arrived moments later, his face grim. "You're not safe anymore," he said. "We need to move you and your sister into protective custody." Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. "Do whatever you need to do. But I'm not backing down." As night fell, Elena sat in a safe house, her mind replaying the events of the day. She had exposed Kane, but at what cost? The network behind him was still out there, and she knew they wouldn't stop until she was silenced. But for the first time she felt a glimmer of hope. The truth was out and the world was watching. She had started a battle she couldn't finish alone, but she wasn't alone anymore. And as the first stars appeared in the night sky, Elena vowed to see it through, no matter what it cost her. Chapter 8. The Cost of Truth. The safe house was suffocating in its silence. Elena paced the small living room, her thoughts circling the same relentless question. Was it enough? Her press conference had unleashed a firestorm. News outlets were dissecting every piece of evidence she'd presented, while Kane's allies scrambled to discredit her. Social media was divided, with some hailing her as a hero and others accusing her of being a fraud. But the masked raid had made one thing clear. The people behind Kane were terrified of the truth she held. Elena glanced at her phone. Grace was in a separate safe house under police protection, but every time Elena thought about her sister's terrified voice on the phone, the guilt threatened to crush her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Detective Ortega stepped inside, his expression as grim as ever. He tossed a file onto the table. "Thought you'd want to see this," he said. Elena opened the file. Inside were photos of the men who had stormed the press conference. Ortega's team had identified two of them, both hired mercenaries with ties to a private security firm linked to Kane's donors. "They're getting desperate," Ortega said. "That's good news for us. Desperate people make mistakes." Elena wasn't so sure. She closed the file and looked at him. "What happens now?" "Now we take this to the next level," Ortega said. "We've issued warrants for Kane's arrest, along with several others in his network. But it's only a matter of time before they retaliate. You need to be ready." Elena nodded, but the weight of her decision pressed down on her. Going public had been the right move, but it had also painted a target on her back and Grace's. That evening, as she sat alone in the safe house, her phone buzzed with another text from an unknown number. "You think you've won. This isn't over." Elena stared at the message, anger bubbling to the surface. She was done being afraid. She grabbed her laptop and began drafting another article, this one aimed directly at the shadowy network behind Kane. If they wanted a fight, she would give them one. The next morning, Kane's arrest made headlines. Footage of him being led away in handcuffs played on every major news channel. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, shouting questions as Kane maintained his composure. His only comment being, "This is a witch hunt. The truth will come out." Elena watched the coverage from the safe house, her emotions a mix of satisfaction and dread. The battle was far from over, but this was a victory. Now, as the day wore on, Ortega called. "We've secured additional evidence from Kane's associates," he said. "But there's something you need to know." Elena's grip on the phone tightened. "What is it?" "One of the men we arrested claims Kane wasn't the mastermind," Ortega said. "He says Kane was just a middleman. Someone higher up was calling the shots." The words sent a chill down Elena's spine. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was another thing entirely. Did he say who? Not yet. But we're working on it. In the meantime, you need to stay vigilant. This isn't over. That night, Elena received another package. Inside was a single piece of paper with the words, "You've gone too far. Leave now or your sister dies." Her hands shook as she stared at the note. She called Ortega immediately. "They know where Grace is," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to move her." "We're already on it," Ortega said. "Stay where you are and let us handle this." But Elena couldn't sit idle. She opened her laptop and began digging into the files Ortega's team had shared with her. Hours passed as she pieced together the connections between Kane's network and the powerful figures behind it. One name kept surfacing: a billionaire industrialist with ties to offshore accounts and private security firms. If Kane was the middleman, this man was the puppet master. The next morning, Elena published her final article. The headline read, "The True Power Behind the Corruption: Unmasking the Puppet Master." The piece detailed everything she had uncovered about the industrialist's ties to Kane and his network. It was her boldest move yet, and her riskiest. The response was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, and social media exploded with calls for an investigation. But Elena knew the cost of her actions. She had declared war on someone far more dangerous than Kane. That night, as she sat in the safe house, the sound of tires screeching outside sent her heart racing. She grabbed her phone and dialed Ortega, but before he could answer, the door burst open. Two masked men stormed in, their weapons trained on her. "Get up," one of them barked. Elena's mind raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. She raised her hands and stood, her heart pounding in her chest. "You've made a lot of enemies," the man said, his voice low and menacing. "But you don't have to die tonight." "What do you want?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "Retract the article. Disappear. Or your sister won't make it through the week." The men left as quickly as they had come, leaving Elena shaken but alive. She called Ortega, her voice shaking as she relayed what had happened. "This is escalating," Ortega said. "We'll move you and Grace to a new location. But you need to decide how far you're willing to go." As dawn broke, Elena sat by the window, watching the sun rise over the horizon. She had come too far to back down now. She had sacrificed too much to let these people win. But she also knew that the cost of her fight would be steep. With a deep breath, she opened her laptop and began writing again. This time it wasn't an article, it was a confession. She laid everything bare: the fabricated evidence, the anonymous video, and the risks she had taken to expose the truth. When she finished, she sent the confession to every major news outlet, attaching the files she had uncovered. If she was going down, she was taking them all with her. As she hit send, she felt a strange sense of peace. The cost of truth was high, but it was a price she was willing to pay. Hours later, the headlines broke. "Journalist confesses to fabrication but exposes global corruption network." The story swept the nation, sparking outrage and calls for justice. Kane and his allies were being dismantled piece by piece, but Elena knew her part in the fight was over. She packed a bag and left the safe house, her future uncertain but her conscience clear. The ultimate deception had cost her everything, but it had also uncovered the truth. And for Elena Moore, that was enough.